Okay, we're going to change tack ever so slightly for this session, a discussion of protocols and standards in realist research. We're also going to change the style of presentation somewhat. Our four presenters, Rebecca, Jeff, Joanne and Mark, will introduce themselves shortly. I'm going to speak for 5 minutes, taking a particular position on the discussion of this ubiquitous term in research, the protocol. It's this term that, for many of us who do realist research, feels like anathema. It's a neologism. It hasn't been around for long. It meant something really quite different up until fairly recently. It was used in international diplomacy, in French diplomacy, the Vatican, and in Russian diplomacy as a structure for particular bulls and deeds to be passed between bureaucrats. And more recently, in the Oxford English Dictionary, it is now defined as the method or procedure for carrying out an experiment or course of medical treatment, the detailed instruction for this. Reading down through its etymological examples in the Oxford English Dictionary, I come to the fourth, which was in 2004, so it is really quite recent that we've been using this term. In Quilter's newsletter, serious term we have here, we selected a protocol for the accelerated aging tests that was developed by the American Association of Textile Chemists and Colorists. Now we are all expected to produce protocols, publish them in BMJ Open, and adhere to them, it would feel. How do realists feel about this? Well, for the next 20 minutes or so, my four colleagues are going to each take their particular position, 5 minutes each, to put their point of view, their ideas about how protocols work, and then a discussion from the floor about the protocol. So I think, Becky, you're going to start. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me okay? So I'm Rebecca Hardwick. I work at the University of Exeter. I'm a PhD student down there. I'm on the side against the use of protocols in realist research, and I will tell you why. So realist methods are there to try and understand the social world. And what we know about the social world is that it's emergent and it's complex. And so in response, we are flexible and adaptable in the methods and the approaches that we use to trying to understand and explain the social world. Realist methods rest on a process of theory testing. We're seeking to explain, and this process is similarly unpredictable and emergent. So although you might be able to start off with some candidate theories about how and why something is happening, you can't necessarily start from the very beginning knowing exactly which candidate theories you're going to be using. So in terms of having a protocol for a study, protocols, as we've heard, seek to specify in advance how you will carry out your study, the theories you'll test, and then how you'll test them, i.e. the methods that you're going to use. However, because you don't always know what these theories are, then how can you at the start know how you're going to test them, what data you're going to be looking for, who you need to talk to, what's in scope and what isn't in scope? Potentially, this may restrict or even negate actually the purpose of your study if you start from the outset by saying that this is all that we're going to do, this is what we're going to look at. So I suggest that it's actually impossible to set them down a priori in a protocol. You can't say what are the theories I'm going to investigate, how I'm going to search for them, how I'm going to test them, and all the exact people that I'm expecting to talk to. You can't write a recipe for realist research. There's an element of creativity to it. What we're doing is using a philosophy of science to apply a lens to a particular research problem. It's a way of seeing. And in that way of seeing, we then decide what do we need to do and how are we going to do it. Alongside that, realist methods are eclectic. They take what they find out there in the real world, this idea of golden nuggets, conversations, blogs, things we might have been seen in leaflets. A whole range of different things that might help us develop and test program theory. Can we know before we've actually started out in the field what we're going to find and exactly what we're going to be using. So protocols for the methodology as a whole. They can also specify standards for how realist methods ought to be done, for example, the Ramesses guidelines. In this way, they act as a demarcation between the right way to do realist methods and the wrong way. And I contend that this might stifle innovation in the future. Would people dare to use a different or innovative method or innovative combinations of methods to test their theories? Will we in fact become the next Cochrane collaboration with only one way to do things right? And so common sense is subverted in the name of dogma. We are realists. We are practical. We are interested in explaining complex problems that face policymakers, decision makers, and practitioners. These are messy research problems, and they need methods that aren't afraid to get down and dirty, and as Nick said earlier, get the seat of our pants dirty. Protocols seek to bring this mess into order, and in doing so, I think that they simply unhelpfully try to clarify the processes of research use before you've even started your research journey. Thank you.
Right, good morning. Jeff Wong. I work part of the time as a GP, and the other time is it's been 9 years since I've been a realist. Right, so I have to apologise for that, but I've been pretty clean and on the wagon still. Right, so, clicker. Yeah, I forgot about that. I actually have slides. Very strict instructions on how many slides. So, as usual, it's probably worth, in any sort of debate, if you want to call it that, then it's important to have definitions. And I think the definition that you'll see up there is not really that far off either the one that Nick has used or Becky has used. So it's a sort of, a procedure for carrying out a scientific experiment of some description. And I think, yes, things are emergent. I would accept that. But I would also say that it's not necessarily true that anything goes. Yeah, to take it to the absurd would be that if you say, well, it's emergent, then at what point does something not become realist? And is it realist? And I think that's possibly where things like a protocol may start to contribute to this. And I'll clarify that a little bit later. This issue as well comes up with the sort of issue of the real world that we live in. Yeah, the real world that we live in, yes, it's a complex world, etc. And I think that, if I were a taxpayer and a funder of some description for our research, it could be an NGO, or it could be one of our, esteemed institutions that rarely ever funds realist research, but let's assume they might. They would like some sort of idea and or clarity regarding what actually are you going to do with this bucket of money that I'm going to give you. Will you just emerge away as you'd like to go along, or perhaps quite reasonably, part of the research involves a long trip to Barbados, right? Who knows, right? So the reality is that we do need to have something. We can argue whether it should be a protocol along the lines of the definition there. So I would put up this map here. I didn't drive up. I'm trying to reduce my carbon footprint. I took the train up. But if you look at the ways up to Leeds, right? So I think the nice, we keep coming on to analogies and metaphors, but the analogy here would be a bit like a road map, really. So I could get from my home up to here, via slightly different routes. I might plan the route to start off with, but I might go up the A1M. Actually, that's the easier one for me to get initially. But I might find there's a bit of a traffic jam, right? So I'm going to turn off onto the M1, and probably find there's going to be a traffic jam. So I'll go to another part, a sort of, a B road. That's a sort of smaller road, and then kind of whittle my way all the way up to Leeds. And I would put it to you that that's what I would think is a useful type of realist protocol. Not one that stipulates you must go up the A1M and get to this junction, turn off here, and then keep going, because you're bound to run into trouble that way. So there is a degree of flexibility within the protocol. But there is still a purpose to it, the purpose being the next thing I'm going to come up with, a bit scary. Yeah. I think that this issue is about transparency. Yeah, and I think this is an enormous issue. What the perspective I come from this is, for all my sins, I do peer reviewing type stuff. And sometimes when you read people's protocols, you really have no idea what they're going to do. In fact, I think it's because they have no idea what they're going to do, which therefore creates a problem. It's really in nobody's interest. It's not in their interest to turn up with something which they have no idea what they're going to do. It's not in their funders' interest if they have funders, or if they're not funded, it's their own time is money to some extent. They could be doing something else, the opportunity cost, right? And it certainly wouldn't be in the interest of the people who actually end up being the so-called recipients of this particular thing they're looking at, because it's just they have no idea what they're doing, right? So I think that the issue here is transparency. It adds to this ability to have a discussion around, well, that sounds like a sensible way of doing things, but you know what? I'm taking issue with here regarding this particular approach of gathering this kind of data, which may not provide you with the relevant information necessary to develop your mechanisms. So I will rest at that point and move on to the next. I took the hint there, and move on to Joanne.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. I'm Joanne Greenhalgh, and I'm in sociology and social policy. And I don't quite know how long I've been a realist for. It was a bit of a sort of long, slow process, as it often is. So, but I guess I wanted to just add that this is we were tasked with doing this, and we wanted almost to be provocative. So I'm hoping that we are being provocative. And I just wanted to add a few things to what Jeff mentioned. And my question then is, if we're talking about different pathways, is how many pathways should we be specifying? What are the options that we could take from getting from London to Leeds? How precise should these pathways, precise should our explanation and detail about these pathways be? What happens if we do take a different pathway? Does that mean that our research is then invalid? And who actually judges that? Who's going to be there if we do something slightly different from the protocol? Who is going to, is it us? Is it the peer reviewers? Is it the community? Does that invalidate your research? If we wander from the protocol, how far do you have to wander before your research gets invalid? And going back to the issue around, specifying your protocol is the issue around how specific should be. Because if you specify it in too much detail, then you run the risk of doing something different, and then there's questions raised about validity. If you don't specify what you're doing enough, it becomes vacuous, it becomes useless or not informative, which is exactly what Jeff was saying, although I'm not supposed to be agreeing with you, but we had this issue when we were writing our proposals, is there's a sense that, there's a feeling you almost have to have done a lot of the work in order to specify some of your theories, in order to make it clear what you're doing, but then you don't want to run the risk of saying, well, this is the only thing I'm going to do, because, if you then do something different, how do you explain it? And how does that get then transformed into this issue of validity and what the meaning of the research is? Because through protocols we can have this assumption that if you don't do what's in it, it's not valid. And it almost becomes a demarcation of to transgress is wrong. So that was the main issues that I wanted to raise, really. So I'll now hand over to Mark.
Hello, my name's Mark Pearson. I'm from Penn Clark at the University of Exeter Medical School. My worry... Oops, oh, they both come up. Oh, well, there you go. So much for that. My worry is that the argument against using protocols in realist research is almost a caricature, as if of what happens in realist research, and it risks portraying it as being like a lone scientist in a lab who's rule-governed, isolated, fixated on microscopic detail. And I really don't think that's the case at all, certainly not in my field of health services research, where the reality in 2015 is that we conduct research collaboratively with stakeholders, a diverse group of stakeholders, whether they be service users, practitioners or managers or so on within the NHS. and we draw on their experiential knowledge throughout the process. So what I think we are moving towards and what we endeavour to do is what has been described by Andrew van der Ven as engaged scholarship. And there are two parts of engaged scholarship which I think speak very much to the need, or the desirability of having protocols for when we do realist research. The first aspect of this is that when we work collaboratively in engaged scholarship with stakeholders, we utilise the distinct competencies and perspectives of those stakeholders to get greater insight into phenomena. And the second aspect is that we manage conflict between those stakeholders constructively, because conflict and disagreement is an inherent part of doing any sort of collaborative research, which I would hope realist research would be. And I would see a collaboratively developed protocol as a key way of facilitating those sorts of discussions and engagement, and therefore I think they're an important part of realist research.
What a wonderfully easy group to chair. Everyone just a very short, pithy interventions and some really interesting insights there, some real breadth. I will go back through them. What I will invite now is for people to start comments, questions, observations. Where would you like to take this discussion about protocols?
Thank you. So, my name is Gero Pictet, and I work with the International Federation of Red Cross, Red Crescent Societies. It took me 5 years to be able to pronounce that, so it's been 5 years. I hate protocols and I hate plans, yet I see the value of a protocol. And the protocol for me is not the research protocol, it's the plan, it's the intervention plan. And my fascination with realism is that it forces the planners to make their assumptions explicit. So if the protocol can be the intervention plan, and if we can have an informed discussion about why this thing would actually work, then you are building your assumptions, the CMOs, and you have a protocol. So I would like to see, I'd like you to see me as a client, and that's what I would suggest if you want to get a job.
And I'm also from the background in health sciences, and I wonder whether where do we got a bit wrong, and whether actually health sciences is starting to take over everything, because protocols come from RCTs and the Cochrane, and this idea that actually have to control everything so minutely that you can test the little bit of testing that you want out, and whether that is actually right for any other research other than in RCT, and whether actually we need to reframe the discussion. And I think we need a plan or a framework, because if you're looking at something, you want to know, is that the right way to answer that question, and is it going to give you an answer? You might not know what the answer is or exactly how you're going to get to the final answer, but you do need to have some framework that you can look and think, well, actually, that is the right way to answer that question, and they do have a plan. The plan might not look the same at the end as it did at the beginning, and I don't think that's a problem, because a lot of qualitative research, you make your framework so open that it allows you to move within that and come to the answering the question, but maybe in a little bit of different ways. Maybe we need to move away from the word protocol and stop being overtaken by maybe it's something else. I'm not saying that from the corporate background. Now.
I think that's really interesting, because I wonder whether it's actually taking something that's come from quite a positivist paradigm and applying it onto something which actually isn't from the same paradigm. And so, in a sense, it's like we're trying to wear the wrong. Oh, I was thinking about the shoes actually. So it's like we've got the wrong shoes on almost. You're saying that actually those shoes probably are beautiful shoes, and never know, we might be wearing them tonight if you go out. But they would be very useful for climbing Mount Everest, for instance. And So it's something like, in terms of what a shoe represents, it's the right thing, in terms of a plan or a framework around what we're going to do, but actually the task to which we want to put it to, which is about being able to really show funders or being able to say, this is the area, the field in which we're going to be working. Potentially the protocol as envisaged by the, like say the RCT community is the wrong pair of shoes actually for our purposes. Would you? Yeah.
I would say we choose what shoes we wear. Yes.
I'm sorry, no, you want to follow up on this particular stream, because I'm probably going to take a slight tell us. Okay. When the classic criticism of trivial research funded by many funders like the ESRC and others is tell us what you want to do, tell us how you're going to do it, tell us your results, tell us your conclusions, recommendations, and if you can do all of that, we might give you them up. So clearly the degree of certainty that is required is not just about protocols, it's a much wider question of pre-planning and knowledge and that you've accumulated. And it seems to me that one of the considerations we ought to bring into all of this is the stage, two things, the stage of knowledge development we're at. You know, if we're at the point where we're still exploring the issue, if we're at the stage where lots of other work has been done, if we're at a stage where we have a fairly good idea of what the mechanisms might be or not, all of those considerations surely would change the appropriate degree of pre-specification and planning, whatever you call it, you might have. The other thing that strikes me is that one of the classic criticisms of non-applied research or evaluation that doesn't take account of the real world is that it's predetermined and not very iterative. So that I think many of these arguments would collapse if we recognize that good work is iterative, which means, okay, you can have a protocol for stage one, and then we'll throw it all up and we'll say, right, now what's the appropriate rules and plans for stage two? And what's the one for the next bit when we discover where we are? And I think the problem is not so much having protocols or plans, it's believing that a rigid plan is anything other than a kind of a fig leaf, unless you recognize that the stages that you're at. And the other metaphor, the other analogy that crosses my mind is the kind of ISO 9003, or however numbers they've got up to these days, where the high-level principle is pretty generic, and it does nothing more than say something about the methods you're hoping to use. Say something about what kinds of data you might envisage. Say something about the first stages of your work. And it's only when you go down various levels in the ISO sort of hierarchy do you get to the point where you say, okay, now specifically, if this is the path you're going down, how do you specify that? But I think those two considerations, the question of what's an appropriate level and what stage are we in the knowledge production process, could unlock a lot of these kinds of debates. And that's a hypothesis.
Thanks very much. I'm going to add a bit to that, much of which I completely agree with. And the first thing I wanted to do, was, my name is Ken Steen. I also work at the Collaboration for Leadership in Applied Health Research and Care, which it's taken me 6 years to learn how to say. The clerk in the Southwest Peninsula, NIHR, blah, blah, blah. We support a number of people doing realist work. Protocols, I just want to say a couple of words about what protocols are. In my experience, protocols in a Cochrane sense are really useful to tell people what you're not going to do. So you get it out first and say, we're not going back beyond 1993 because of the following reasons. We're going to only look at English language articles because of the following reasons. So it helps people to understand what you're not going to do. That's very useful. The other aspect of protocols and a kind of rigid, dogmatic requirement to say them, which I think is really important, is the statistical analysis plans that pharmaceutical companies put in with their RCTs are crucially important, because they actually try and work out what the probabilities are that they're going to get a result that would be regarded as fallacious, given the numbers that are going through. This is a really boring, I'm sorry, deeply technical statistical thing to do, but it is important to define your type 1 and type 2 errors in setting out something, because then, if the pharmaceutical company decides to ignore the numbers that have gone through the trial, and publish the trial ahead of time in order to get some serious leverage on marketing some expensive drug that we may not actually as a society want to support, then we've got some ammunition to say, hang on a minute, you said you were going to wait until you'd only spent this much of your p-values, and you've gone ahead half-cocked, and it may be that you've actually found a spuriously positive finding. So there are some really positive things about protocols. You'll have noticed those are two examples from outside the context of realist evaluation, where I think the idea that something is emergent, if that's in essence what we're doing here, it's stupid to think that you can have a protocol that is nailed down all the way from the start to the end. I'm sorry, but it just seems like that to me. And so what's just been said about mapping out the first steps seems reasonable. Understanding what the contingencies are, so to borrow your excellent metaphor of getting here, how much petrol have you put in the car? So you know that you've got a range of about 300 miles, so once you've only got so far, you can tell, sorry, I'm not going to make it to Leeds. I'm on the B3175 and I'm near Cambridge. I'm not going to make it. So you can know before you've spent all your petrol that you're not going to make it, and that's really useful, and that does help your expectations. And you can sort of think, is there something else I can do? Well, I can go into get the Wi-Fi, I can connect, and I can get to the conference by Wi-Fi so that I don't have to get there. So you can form some other kind of plan that's going to get you around whatever barriers you face. But I like the idea of setting out what you, at the very least, you have to set out what the first steps are going to be, and then after that, what the contingencies are like to be and what possible courses of action you can have. That seems to me just a very sensible thing to do.
While I'm walking over, you remind me that the Wi-Fi is intermittent in the conference at the moment. It's a British Telecom problem, evidently, not a modem here problem. So keep trying.
Thanks, Nick. Gary Dimsky from Economics here at Leeds. We have the same problem when students and researchers are doing surveys in communities now, that there's an insistence we have control groups and precision and all of this, which seems excessive. You know, if you've never tried to go and interview people in favelas and then you start thinking about control groups, it becomes ridiculous. But my question is, because I've sent some of my students to talk to you and it's been very productive, they come back talking about that they're going to do mixed methods. So I wanted to know, is mixed methods a different way in your view as realist of talking about this iterative discovery process? Is this is this in a sense this similar thing in a different guise? All these students want to do mixed methods now.
The reason, I'll do this very briefly because I'm not quite sure how, but the reason why I suggest it is because it's a method that follows the idea, the theory of the middle range that needs to be tested. Not the other way around. So there's an assumption that we all come from disciplinary backgrounds and experiences. I'm predominantly a qualitative researcher. I feel very comfortable doing qualitative researching. I do a certain degree of secondary analysis of quantitative data. For many researchers, we would start there. So I am a qualitative researcher, therefore I will frame my research problem so that I end up doing qualitative researching. If you're being driven by the theory, if it's ideas that are carrying you forward in a particular piece of research, then it is the idea that will tell you, now, that is the method that's going to be most appropriate for doing that particular part of this particular study. In brief.
Inna Kochetkova from University of Leeds. I have a question for the panel. I sort of buy into the idea of the protocol is important to a certain extent, so we know how much petrol to put in. But what I personally struggle with, and I'm interested to hear your responses, is how do we decide when we start the research? Because in order to formulate the research idea or the research question, we need to engage in conversations, understand the context, so we're already gathering the data, and then the gatekeepers require us to actually gain permission. For example, if we're talking about NHS, we need to get some R&D approval to actually talk to staff members because in fact they saw the interviews. So it's kind of the conundrum that I currently don't really know. So where would we say, okay, now I am actually doing the research, so this is the first starting point on my protocol? Thank you.
Charlotte Ray.
I found this conversation very, very interesting, and I think agreed with 90% of what's been said. So what's going on? Where's the debate? And interestingly, when the first four speakers spoke, I nodded and nodded and nodded. Though my heart belongs to Becky, in that I've always found myself muddling through in a way I couldn't have anticipated. But the question I wanted to ask is the one that Joanne raised, which is the conundrum, I think. That is to say, you said something like, in exploring program theories, you need to have done much of the research before you've started in order to set down what you'll do. And I think there lies the nub of the problem, and it's nothing to do with protocols, it's how research is let. And it's let as a series of completely discrete individual projects. Here comes a new intervention. Go for it, dear evaluator. Whereas the fact is that all interventions are brothers and sisters and cousins and nephews and share the same idea base. So what's needed is a way of being smarter in the way that they've let. We know. Because of all the previous research, we know this already, and we want you to explore this, that, and the other, but it simply doesn't happen like that.
I suppose it might be useful to reflect, because I think your statement really reflects what you were saying about, well, where does the research start? And I think Ray's just mentioned that actually you're doing it all the time, and it's kind of in a way an artificial start point as to when you then start your protocol. But I kind of think what we're debating here is almost different program theories about what a protocol is and what it's supposed to be achieving. So far I've heard it's a way of calling people to account when drug companies want to, flaunt what they said they're going to do. It's a way of creating a shared language between different researchers. It's a way of enabling transparency. And I suppose our job probably is to think about, well, what mechanism do we want to trigger? And in what context? And what Elliot said was that depends on the state of knowledge that we have about that research area. So where we don't know a lot about it, maybe we want a protocol to serve one kind of function. In another setting, we want it to serve another function. So as a true realist, I guess my sense is that it depends. I don't know if anybody wants to add that. That fudged. There you go.
That's a surprise.
Becca, do you want to make comments?
So a slight confession. When I started working at Exeter, it was on a project to do with shared care, and one of the first things that Rob Anderson and Mark Pearson got me to do was a protocol, which we had published in Systematic Reviews Journal, and it was a realist review, and I had a high time of it trying to work out how you translate a realist approach into the very standardised way in which protocols are generally set out for systematic reviews. And I'd say I did actually check, and then I got embarrassed because it was about 8 months, more than 8 months before we'd actually settled on, what is our protocol. And there was a lot of value in that in terms of definitions and what was in scope and what was out of scope, as Ken said. But that was research too. And actually a lot of the stuff which I've been doing since then on that project has been very much refining the initial ideas which came out of the literature that I had to read in order to write the protocol. So I'd say they can take a long time to do, but it's not necessarily time wasted. But there was a part of me that was thinking, when do I actually get to do the review? And it wasn't really until hindsight that I looked back and saw that there was a value in it. So that's a bit of a confession. I've done one. It was only one.
I've done two. That's right.
Yes, hi, Justin Jagosh, University of Liverpool. We published a protocol for the review we did on participatory research, but we didn't published the protocol before we started the review. So what I'm about to say may have relevance to particular kinds of reviews. For our review, when we started looking at the literature, we started with 7,000 plus citations, and we were totally lost. And through the process of reading citations, we started to iteratively develop identification, selection, and appraisal tools from which we started to funnel this literature. And we also were in the process of conceptualizing our research questions, conceptualizing the outcomes that we were trying to get at. So if we had written the protocol in advance of doing any of that work, it would have been totally useless and rubbish. But at a certain stage, for our review anyway, we spent 8 months going through identification, selection, and appraisal before we did the synthesis, which was really the CMO configuration, and also trying to refine our program theories, which we were also lost about. So in our particular case, we published our protocol at the end of identification, before synthesis. And there was some debate about whether we published in Implementation Science, and we thought, should we frame this as we are about to do, even though we had already done? And in the end, we decided to just go with, we have already done this. These are the tools we use. These are the numbers of citations and full text articles that we have been looking at through the process, and now we will begin a synthesis using CMO configuration. We weren't sure if they would be okay with that, because it shows that we've already gone down the road, but they published it as a protocol. So they maybe recognized that a realist approach, you can publish a protocol midway through the process.
Can I ask a question back to you, Justin? Do you think it was useful to publish the protocol in terms of achieving transparency, increasing connections or engagement with stakeholders, etc.?
I fit by the end of this.
That was actually the point that I forgot to say was, yes, it was useful, but maybe not for the reason you might suspect. For us, the main use of that was that we were able to push all that description of what we did into a protocol paper to create word count space in our findings paper, because the realist approach will give you so much to say that if we try to include all of that, what we did, our procedure, protocols, identification tools, etc., in the findings paper, we would have been left with a very little amount of space. So in our findings paper, we just said, look at our protocol paper to know how we did it, and then we had lots of room in the findings paper for the findings. That was the main thing, yeah.
So the protocol becomes an extended account of method in the research. It becomes an extended account of method in the research. More comments, observations? Jill.
I want to pick up what I think is an absolute furphy in relation to protocols, this idea that somehow writing a protocol stifles innovation. The assumption that is built into that is that innovation will only happen and can only happen at a particular point in time, and that it's after you wrote the protocol. And that it's within that particular research project. And I think that couldn't be more fallacious. You can innovate while you write your protocol, while you are designing your methods, while you are thinking. There is nothing about saying, here is the direction for my research, here's my roadmap, that necessarily stifles any kind of creative process. So that would be my first point. The second one would be picking up Joe's absolutely beautiful realist analysis of the conversation that we're having and say, we're talking about protocols as though they are a single thing. No, they're not. There are different kinds of protocols that you write for different kinds of research projects and or reviews, and different people who say thou shalt use our kind of protocol actually have different rules and guidelines for how you use them. And the protocols have a range of different processes, purposes and uses to a range of different people. So while I absolutely agree that the process of writing them can be a right royal pain in the neck, and that sometimes you have to go back and say, we're adapting our protocol because it's a bit like refining your research ethics approval for certain kinds of research, then that in itself is not I don't think that's problematic. I don't think that's a barrier. I think we have to be much clearer about which kinds of protocols, for which kinds of purposes, for which kinds of audiences are useful to forward both the work and the transparency of the work. Becky wants a knack. I'll just give it straight to her.
That was just a flinch. I was just thinking about contrasting this idea of transparency between the introduction that Nick gave around this disputatious community of scholars, and between the function of a written piece of paper. And I suppose in my head I was thinking, when we think about one of the functions or reasons for a protocol is so to enable transparency, so we can see what they said they do, and then did they do that, and if they didn't, why? And it was making me think about, how is that a mechanism for how a disputatious community of scholars would go about judging and questioning each other? I don't know.
That's all right. Well, yes, okay. Well, yeah. Well, yes, I think it is a mechanism by which the disputatious community can proceed, because it's a common point of reference, and I don't think it's a problem if you document how your eventual research changed from what was in the protocol. That is just simply part of being a good scientist or researcher. And that's the one way of achieving transparency. And I would just pick up on Jill's point as well about what kinds of protocols for which people or which stakeholders and for what purposes. If the goals of a protocol, in my view, which is being clear about what you think you will do, are communicated in a completely different way than a protocol in a scientific journal, I think that's absolutely fine. That would depend on the individual project.
I'm Jill Harvey from the University of Adelaide. I suppose I just wanted to pick up the comment that the protocol in terms of transparency is about, did you do what you said you'd do? To me, it's also about, can I trust these people to do their research in a rigorous and a robust way? So yeah, I agree with what other people said. There are different types, but it isn't just a checking back. For me, it's actually trusting that these people are going to do their research in a rigorous way, and that you can then have confidence in how they'll do the process and the findings that they put forward.
I'm Lynn Williams from Bangor University. My point, I guess it just follows on from Jill's there, is that I wonder, with my nurse's hat on here, whether protocols, in a similar way to how in the healthcare community we use pathways and protocols and we look at, deviation from norms, I wonder as a community, should we be getting together to look at, when people report deviations to their protocols, is there a pattern? Are there sort of gaps, in understanding or in tools and resources that we have? And maybe that we can build up, as a realist community, sort of, these issues seem to happen when type of scenarios. So just think.
Just a short remark. Bruno Marchal from ITM in Antwerp. The title of this session is saying protocols and standards. I think we've been talking a lot about protocols, about how we're going to do things, but what about the standards? So I'm missing a bit of a discussion on this discussion, the point of being clear about what is a good realist evaluation, what's a good realist synthesis, and can that be protocolized, can that be standardized?
Of coming in, so I'm trying to be really, really good and listen, because I'm trained well. So just to there's another sort of function of I think, protocols, particularly in the sort of stage of development, if you want to call it that, where there are increasingly properly funded projects of realist natures. So, and one of them is actually learning from them. So that people sometimes put them out because they think, actually, we think we've got a really clever way of solving problem X. Yeah, and let's put that out there. And as Mark has said, it becomes a sort of reference point where people do, believe it or not, actually read some of these protocols. So that's sort of an interesting aspect in itself, because they're used as a sort of learning, an opportunity to learn. Some of the journals have slightly different policies regarding this, but some of them don't like publishing protocols if they're too far down the line of the project. And the rationale for that, which is also a learning rationale, is that if you kind of got to the point of data collection and analysis, you're probably not going to change your protocol. But within the peer review for the protocol, if it's gone to the right type of people, you might well get a very helpful learning point, which is, have a think about this. It may not be the best way of approaching this particular problem. So it is part, again, of an opportunity to get discussion and discourse around perhaps ways of helping individuals to advance. When it comes to standards, well, I think that there are standards and there are standards, and I think very much the same sort of arguments go through, in the sense that I don't think anything goes. If anything goes, then we will have this continual problem of the fake handbag, which is people just do something, give it a label because it happens to have addressed the issue of for whom, in what circumstances, and therefore it's realist. So that's, almost a sort of caricature of many of the evaluations and reviews that I've read. And then none that I've led, of course. Absolutely none. So you've interrupted my train of thought there. I've completely forgotten what I was going to say. This is why you don't interrupt people, Jill. Anyway, the reality is that we do have to have some sort of a degree of agreement as to what we would classify as being at least realist. And there's a very, very, very practical reason for this, which hit home to me when I went to a particular Cochrane conference, actually. Yes, I do go to them. No one hits me there. And it was that one of my colleagues came up to me and said, Jeff, I'm already doing realist reviews. And I said, really? And I went, yeah. And I didn't think he was. Right, so we had an interesting discussion, a discourse, a disputatious community. So I said, what were you reading? So he read all this stuff, and he sort of rolled off some of them. This is just after I'd done the Ramses I project, so I knew quite a lot of these just by name. This review and that review and this review. But they were just not good exemplars. Yeah. So in effect, what he was doing was reading bad exemplars and then saying, but that's what I do. Yep. So how in the world is that going to progress? How in the world is that in the interest of anybody, I would say? Yeah. It lets down the person themselves who does it, because in effect they're not admitting or accepting that they perhaps have an incomplete understanding of an approach. It lets down whoever was funding them, because they basically just got something that was just made up. I would say pretty Frankenstein, or the picture that Joanne has up there, which is a bit of a dog's dinner. Yeah. And then ultimately, it doesn't necessarily help the sort of recipients of research, because the difficulty is that you end up making often cookbook claims or laundry list claims. We must now do this, right? Which is immensely unrealist, because it's not contextualized in any way, it's not contingent in any way, and unhelpful. Yeah. So I think we do have to have some standards. I would completely agree with the issue that the standards may be debatable, but some very clever person, and it wasn't me, from the Ramses I project had changed the E, the last E of Ramesses, I think used to be expected. Right, but I can't remember who it was. It might be one of those miscreants in this corner here. I actually changed it. No, it should be evolving, right? And that's a very subtle change, but it's a signal, I hope, that it will evolve, because if we got it right in the first place, why in the world do we need the project?
Any more comments? Please, Elliot.
I'm a bit worried that this conversation is methods-led, and I'm thinking it should be question-led, and it partly leads me back to the standards issue. So I think one of the things that a good design, paper, plan, protocol can do is can say not only what you are going to do, but what you're not going to do. And partly it relates to the kind of questions you're asking. So, you know, at one level, everything is realist in the kind of philosophical worldview kind of sense, but methodologically, if your questions are about extent and quantity of effects in different circumstances, you'll have difficulty if you confine yourself entirely to a realist methodology, although you can still use realist logics in there. And it sort of worries me that we're not linking, and that's where you get to standards really, which is what is something you can reasonably do to answer these questions in these circumstances. And it gets back to the little exchange that occurred earlier around mixed methods. I mean, I hate the word mixed methods. I mean, your bits of triangulation to see whether if I speak to 5 different guys and look at some administrative data, I get the same stuff. That's not what's interesting. What's interesting is mixed designs. And therefore, I'm really interested when you can combine realist synthesis with an econometric analysis. You know, but these are completely different designs, but they potentially can answer quite different sorts of questions. So I think that one of the strong points about a good protocol, paper, whatever, is that it makes it clear what you can do and what you can't do, and what is adjacent to what you're doing and what is dependent on what you're doing. This is an attempt to be provocative, so I'm hoping really that there will be an enormous reaction from somebody to that provocation.
You know, I'll have a little bit picked up again in 10 years' time. At a conference, someone will say, Elliot said. Oh, right, so you better respond to it now. I agree, absolutely. Any comments, observations? You look worried? The realist methods are driven by ideas or questions.
Were you saying at the end there, Elliot, about knowing what sort of what you're doing and what you're not doing? And I guess my rejoinder is, no, okay, so, and at what degree of granularity, I suppose, is what I'm wondering, is because that was one of the things that we were thinking about, was actually how specific can you be, or do you need to be, and who is telling you that actually your degree of specificity is or isn't the right degree of specificity. So that if you accept that it's important to be able to, obviously when you start doing research, to have an idea of, you know, why, what am I doing is important, and what am I doing. But to what extent can you know what the important question is until you've actually spent time in the field or time in the literature? And I guess, I'm just puzzling about that. I'm just thinking about Ray talks a lot about concept mapping and mapping the landscape basically around an intervention policy or programme at the outset, and getting a feel for what are the contentious debates, what are the problem issues here. And there's part of me that's thinking from a very pragmatic way. If your funder says we need someone to find out about X, that tells you. But on the other hand, actually, what if when you go into the field you're trying to find out about X, but actually everyone keeps telling you it's Y?
I don't want to hog this, but you're coming at this quite explicitly from a research point of view. What do the funders expect? I'm coming at it a bit from a policy point of view, which is I'm in a ministry or department, and I want to know some answers to questions that I'm setting you. And one of the questions I want to know is why, but one of the questions I want to know is how big is it, and does it really matter? And if I'm asking that question as a commissioner from within a policy-making department, it's legitimate to say, please look at this question.
I just want to make a realist joke, if there is such a thing. One of which is, if someone came up to me and said, by the way, I've got this brand new drug, it was evaluated using a realist evaluation, and then we did a realist synthesis on it, right? Will you take it? And the answer will be no, okay? So I think the point of this is that there are definitely certain questions which you probably shouldn't bother to use a realist approach for. And one of them would be if somebody just wants to know whether it can work. It frankly doesn't matter, they don't bother to unpack the black box, but if what they want is an effect size number, so that they can then adjudicate between should we do it, this sort of type of thing, groups, or should we do it via individuals, fair enough. But to then ask you the next question is, well, how am I then going to implement it? Yep. Then they should come to our door. So that's probably the sort of very realistic thing we have to do about this. I think it's a job creation scheme. I don't actually think we should be going around, making people in clinical trial units feel bad, because they actually do very valuable work for certain sorts of things. For example, pharmaceuticals, really, really important part of modern medicine. But hey, I really wouldn't want one which was evaluated by a realist evaluation.
Excuse me, I've got to be disputatious. Briefly disputatious, unless, of course, you happen to think that your drug is going to work differently for different people, as they often do for men and women, or for different age groups, as they often do for children or adults. At which point, I actually do want my design to have been at least a little bit realistically informed, because they're actually working through different mechanisms to generate different outcomes.
No, you're this conversation about what it is now, or I'd like his to brief summary of things.
And I would agree, and I suspect what happens in drug development is all that complex, messy stuff gets done first before they go to RCT. And I agree. No, but I think this has been a really interesting discussion, and I think it really is a question of protocols in context, because for me, my understanding, when I first came to the idea of protocol in the context of Cochrane reviews, whereby if you deviate from that, that's invalid. So it's almost like the demarcation, and the reason, the underlying assumption is these researchers can't be trusted to do what they say they're going to do, so we need to hold them to account. And so that, I think that's why it's important to think about these different program theories, underlying protocols, and think about which one is, if any, is appropriate for realist methods. So.
Your final observations?
My final observations are that no, the CMO police will not come and kick your door down like the Stasi. But I would also say that it's really, really important that you do think through what you're going to do, put it down, because it's one way as a point of reference to allow yourself to figure out whether actually have I done what I said I would do, and then why would I want to do it in the first place. So it is certainly about putting down as a point of reference. It's about transparency, and I would also say it's about the fact that you can write in flexibility into protocols. Yeah. So if you want to do that, you can definitely do that, and that gives you get out of jail free, because you can anticipate some of the problems.
And just a couple of short reflections. One, I think the point that the woman sitting at the back said about working out what the common gaps are, the demi-regularities, I suppose, in terms of where protocols aren't fulfilled in the way that we anticipated in realist research, would be really interesting to look at. And the other thing was that there's a TV programme in the UK called Downton Abbey, which you might have heard about, and it's the last episode on Sunday. And when we were talking about standards earlier, I just kept on thinking about Lady Mary, because she has very good standards, doesn't she?
Follow that one. My final brief reflection is perhaps tangentially related to the point that Elliot raised about different perspectives, for example, from policymakers or commissioners and their role within research. And I think we are still underexplored, and this discussion has been quite methods-focused, researcher-focused, and I think that the potential role for protocols or other forms of communication for involving stakeholders in collaborative research should be explored more.
Thank you all. We started this discussion with a very dry definition from the Oxford English Dictionary, which ended with a observation as a detailed instruction for the progression of experiments, which took all of the relationships out of it. What's been interesting about listening to this discussion and what makes realism tick, I think, is that what has happened over the last while is that we've had a discussion which has been an normative evaluation of research, of researchers, of research participants and research users. And that gets wrapped into our understanding of what protocols and standards have to be if they are to be useful tools, mechanisms, accounts of the way in which we do research. Thank you very much, everyone, for participating in this discussion. We're going to take a 2-hour lunch break now, which is a bit unusual for a conference, I accept. But it's all part of, we hope, being part of that disputatious community. I hope that over your lunch, opportunity to discuss some of the ideas from this morning, to think about the ideas for this afternoon and for tomorrow. And we look forward to having conversations with everybody over the lunch period. We'll call you back in a couple of hours' time. Goodbye for now.